Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into one of the most curious questions at the edge of science. Could your mind be connected to the universe in ways far stranger than we have ever imagined? Could the delicate workings of your thoughts, your feelings, and your awareness be shaped not only by the billions of neurons in your brain, but by the subtle, invisible dance of quantum physics? But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own little slice of time. Now feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into this mysterious frontier of consciousness together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. There is a certain stillness in the night when thoughts seem to echo louder. The world outside is quiet, the ticking of a clock almost exaggerated, the small creaks of your home amplified into little markers of time passing. It's in moments like this, when distractions fall away, that you might start wondering about the nature of your own thoughts. Your brain is busy, even now. Billions of neurons, each branching into thousands of tiny connections, exchanging signals with a rhythm as intricate as any symphony. But some scientists believe this is only part of the story. Beneath this familiar dance of electrical impulses and chemical messengers, there may be something else, something smaller, stranger, and more delicate, hiding deep within your brain cells. Picture, if you will, the tiniest scaffolding inside those neurons. They are called microtubules, cylindrical protein structures that help maintain the cell's shape, transport materials, and organize important processes. In most biology textbooks, they are functional, almost boring. The way scaffolding on a building is rarely admired for beauty. But to a certain anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff, and to a mathematician and physicist named Roger Penrose, these microtubules are far from ordinary. They might be the quiet stage on which something remarkable happens, the quantum processes that could give rise to consciousness itself. Quantum processes. Even saying those words invites a sense of mystery. At the scale of atoms and subatomic particles, the universe does not follow the neat and predictable rules we see in our everyday lives. Instead, it plays a stranger game. Particles can be in multiple places at once, can influence each other instantly across vast distances, and seem to exist in a cloud of possibilities until something forces them to choose. Penrose and Hameroff propose that inside your microtubules, quantum events might be taking place. Events so subtle they are drowned out in most other warm, wet environments. But here, somehow, they could survive long enough to matter. And when these quantum states collapse, when the haze of possibilities becomes a definite reality, that moment might be the spark of a conscious experience. Not the memory of your grandmother's garden, not the taste of your morning coffee, but the very feeling of being aware in this moment. It is, as you might guess, a controversial idea. The brain, after all, is not an isolated laboratory setup, cooled to near absolute zero. It's a warm, noisy, biological environment. Critics argue that quantum states here would break down far too quickly, lasting perhaps a trillionth of a second before dissolving into randomness. But the question lingers, because nature has a way of surprising us. In the last 2 decades, scientists have discovered quantum effects in places they never expected. In the leaves of plants, sunlight energy seems to take a quantum shortcut, moving through photosynthetic machinery with an efficiency that defies classical explanation. In the eyes, or perhaps more accurately in the inner compass, of certain birds, quantum entanglement might help them navigate thousands of miles using Earth's magnetic field, Even in enzymes, those tireless molecular machines of life, quantum tunneling might help them work faster than chemistry alone would predict. So the idea that quantum effects might also be playing out inside our brains no longer sounds quite as impossible as it once did. And if they are, the implications are vast. Consciousness would not just be an emergent property of neurons firing, it would be bound up with the fundamental fabric of reality itself. You would not simply be in the universe would be, in some strange way, inside you. And yet, the heart of the mystery is not just whether quantum physics plays a role in thought, it's also whether this could mean that our awareness is somehow non-local, that it could, in principle, connect to distant places, distant times, or even other minds in ways we don't yet understand. This is not to say that such abilities are proven, only that the theory leaves the door open, just a crack, to possibilities we have barely begun to imagine. For now, you can think of this theory, called orchestrated objective reduction, or Orch-OR, as a bridge. One foot planted firmly in neuroscience, the other in the deep waters of quantum mechanics. It stretches across a canyon that has long separated the study of mind from the study of matter. Crossing it will take us through questions of physics, biology, philosophy, and even technology. We'll meet critics who argue it cannot work, and evidence that suggests maybe, just maybe, it can. We'll look at what it could mean for medicine, treating the mind at its smallest scales, and for AI, where the quest to build a conscious machine might hinge on whether quantum processes are required for awareness. We'll even wander into the more speculative edges, where questions about free will, identity, and the universe's own self-awareness come into play. But tonight, as we begin, there's no need to hurry. We'll walk slowly. We'll let each idea unfold like a page turning in an old, well-loved book. You can let the technical details wash over you, catching only the shapes and colours of the thoughts. The science will be there, waiting, but so will the quiet, the kind that lets you notice the soft hum in the background of your own mind. Because whether or not this theory is true, it asks us to see consciousness not as a machine ticking away in our heads, but as something far more delicate, far more connected, perhaps a whisper between the brain and the stars. If you close your eyes for a moment and let the outside world fade, you may notice something curious. There is a soft theatre inside your mind where thoughts appear, move, and dissolve without needing to ask permission. You may not know where a thought comes from before it arrives, or where it goes when it slips away. People have been wondering about that hidden stage for as long as stories have been told. Long before we had microscopes to peer into cells or equations to describe the behaviour of particles, there was already a sense, half wonder, half longing, that the mind was not entirely contained by the body. Ancient cultures often pictured consciousness as a thread connecting the human soul to something greater. In Egypt there was the Ka, a kind of life essence that lingered beyond death. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Plato imagined an eternal realm of perfect forms, with our minds as imperfect reflections. In India, the Upanishads spoke of Atman, the inner self, as one with Brahman, the universal reality. Even in quieter corners of the world, far from temples or academies, people spoke in simple ways about the mind being touched by the stars, the wind, or the unseen currents of the earth. For centuries these were poetic images, not scientific theories. They existed in myths, in sacred texts, in art and music. Then, in the 17th century, a different kind of question began to take shape, a mechanical one. Thinkers like René Descartes tried to imagine the mind as separate from the body, while others began to picture the brain itself as a kind of machine. With the scientific revolution came new tools for studying anatomy and physics, and the old mystery was dressed in a new language. Instead of souls and cosmic threads, we spoke of nerves, impulses, and mechanisms. As the centuries unfolded, neuroscience emerged, mapping the brain with ever more precision. We learned about neurons and synapses, about neurotransmitters and electrical spikes. The idea of the brain as a complex network of biological circuits became dominant, and yet a stubborn puzzle remained. Even if we could explain how signals travel through the brain, could that ever truly explain what it feels like to be you? Could a map of connections capture the warm familiarity of a childhood memory, the taste of ripe fruit in summer, or the quiet ache of longing? By the late 20th century, some scientists began to ask whether the gap between brain activity and subjective experience, the hard problem of consciousness, might require a new approach. One of them was Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist fascinated not just by equations, but by the moments of insight that seemed to come from nowhere. Penrose had spent years studying the laws of the universe, especially the strange rules of quantum mechanics. He suspected that human understanding, especially in moments of creativity or deep awareness, might rely on something beyond the step-by-step processes that computers follow. In the 1990s, Penrose met Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist with his own curiosity about consciousness. Hameroff had spent much of his career observing what happens when anesthesia takes awareness away, and then gently brings it back. He had been drawn to the microtubules inside neurons, tiny hollow cylinders of protein that acted like an internal skeleton for the cell, but also seemed to be involved in more dynamic processes. To Hameroff, these microtubules looked like the kind of structure that could support delicate patterns, perhaps even quantum ones. Together they developed a theory they called orchestrated objective reduction, or Orch-OR. In their picture, quantum states could exist within the microtubules, holding multiple possibilities at once, like a coin balanced on its edge, neither heads nor tails. At certain moments, these states would collapse, not randomly, but in a way shaped by the fundamental fabric of reality. Each collapse, they suggested, might correspond to a tiny moment of conscious experience, and the orchestration of many such moments could produce the continuous flow of awareness we live in. It was an elegant bridge between two worlds, the hard surfaces of biology and the shimmering uncertainty of quantum physics. It promised an answer to the binding problem, the question of how different sensations, processed in different parts of the brain, come together into a single unified experience. It also echoed, in a faint but unmistakable way, those ancient ideas that the mind might be linked to something larger than itself. But the moment they presented their theory, the criticisms arrived. Other scientists pointed out that quantum states are notoriously fragile, easily disrupted by heat and motion. The brain, they argued, was warm, wet, and noisy. Not at all the controlled, low-temperature environment where physicists usually coax quantum effects to appear. The time scale for quantum coherence in such conditions, critics calculated, would be far too short to play any meaningful role in the slow chemical and electrical processes of the brain, and yet the question would not quite go away. In the same decades that Orch-OR was being debated, researchers in an entirely different field, quantum biology, were beginning to uncover evidence that living systems could maintain quantum states at ordinary temperatures. They found it in the green machinery of photosynthesis, in the navigation of migrating birds, even in the chemical reactions of enzymes. If plants and birds and proteins could do it, perhaps neurons could too. So here we are, with one foot in an ancient mystery and the other in modern science. We stand between myths of the soul and diagrams of the cell, between cosmic poetry and laboratory data. The path from the temples of old to the research labs of today is not as long as it seems. It is a single thread woven through centuries of human wonder. In the sessions ahead, we will follow that thread more closely. We will look at what quantum mechanics really means for something as complex as the human brain, at the experiments that hint at its possibility, and at the ways this idea might reshape not just science, but medicine, technology, and philosophy. We will meet the critics again and see whether their arguments hold firm, and we will let the question remain open. as questions often do in the quiet hours before sleep. For now, just remember, the story of consciousness has always been a meeting point of imagination and evidence. The details may change, the language may shift from gods to neurons, from cosmic winds to quantum states, but the sense of mystery endures, and in that mystery, perhaps, is where the mind feels most at home. If you were to meet Roger Penrose on a quiet afternoon, perhaps in a sunlit office lined with books and the faint smell of old paper, you might first notice the way his thoughts seem to move at their own pace, unhurried, but never aimless. He has the air of someone who enjoys following a question down a long and winding path, even if it means straying far from where he started. His voice is calm, but his words often carry you into places where mathematics and imagination blur together. Penrose has spent most of his life exploring the universe not with a telescope, but with equations. He has worked on the deep structure of space and time, on black holes and singularities, on the geometry of the cosmos itself. Many of his ideas have reshaped modern physics, and some have been bold enough to challenge the standard views of how the universe works. But perhaps the boldest of all is his conviction that the human mind cannot be fully explained by the standard model of neuroscience, that there is something in our capacity for thought, insight, and understanding that lies beyond what any ordinary computation can produce. To appreciate why Penrose thinks this way, it helps to remember the world in which his ideas took shape. In the late 20th century, the rise of computer science encouraged a certain view of the brain, that it was, in essence, a biological computer. Neurons acted like logic gates, electrical signals flowed like data, and mental processes could be seen as algorithms running in the wetware of the brain. This analogy was appealing. It made consciousness seem like a problem of complexity. If you could build a network as intricate as the human brain, with enough connections and enough speed, perhaps consciousness would simply emerge. But Penrose was not convinced. He believed that human understanding, especially the flashes of genuine creativity and intuition, went beyond what any step-by-step algorithm could achieve. He drew on the work of mathematician Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems show that in any formal system of logic, there are truths that cannot be proven within that system. Penrose argued that the human mind can see the truth of such statements, and that this ability is fundamentally non-algorithmic. If the brain were just a computer, it should be bound by the same limits as any formal system. But it seems to Penrose that we are not. If thought is not purely algorithmic, then perhaps it draws on a different kind of process, one that is embedded in the underlying physics of reality. This is where quantum mechanics enters his story. In the quantum world, the line between possibility and actuality is blurred. A particle's state is described by a wave function, which contains all the possible outcomes. Only when the wave function collapses, when a measurement or some other decisive event occurs, does one specific reality come into being. Penrose proposed that this collapse might not be purely random, as many physicists believe, but could instead be driven by a physical process he called objective reduction, or OR. In this view, a quantum state will naturally collapse when the difference between its possible realities becomes significant enough in terms of space-time curvature. That is, when the gravitational separation between these realities reaches a certain threshold. In his equations, this collapse happens not because of an outside observer, but because the structure of space and time itself cannot sustain the superposition any longer. Now, imagine applying that to the brain. Penrose suggested that if quantum states existed within certain structures in our neurons, their collapses could correspond to moments of conscious awareness. Each collapse would be like a frame in the movie of our mind, and the sequence of collapses would weave together into the stream of experience we know as consciousness. At this stage, his idea needed a partner from the biological side, a way to explain how quantum states could exist in the warm, noisy environment of the brain long enough to matter. That's where Stuart Hameroff would later come in. with his focus on microtubules. But even before their meeting, Penrose's vision had already reshaped the conversation. He was saying, in effect, that the physics of consciousness might be as fundamental to the universe as the physics of gravity or light. To some, this was an inspiring possibility. It suggested that the mind was not just an emergent property of matter, but a feature woven into the very fabric of reality. To others, it was a leap too far, built on speculation rather than data. The debates would become fierce, but for Penrose, the pursuit of truth was worth enduring the criticism. When you listen to him speak about these ideas, there's a sense that he sees beauty in the symmetry of it all. The idea that the same laws shaping the birth of stars and the collapse of black holes might also shape the birth of a thought in your mind. There is no rush in his explanations. He prefers to guide you step by step, like showing you around a familiar landscape where every hill and shadow holds a story. And whether or not you agree with him, you can feel that this is not just an intellectual exercise. For Penrose, the question of consciousness is a doorway into understanding what the universe itself is made of, and perhaps why it exists at all. As we move forward, we will meet the other half of this unlikely partnership. Where Penrose brought the deep physics and mathematical vision, Stuart Hameroff brought the intimate hands-on knowledge of the human brain as a living, breathing system. And together they would try to build a bridge between neurons and quantum fields, a bridge that might one day carry us across the gap between matter and mind. If Roger Penrose approached the mystery of consciousness from the vast, abstract landscape of mathematics and physics, Stuart Hameroff arrived at it from the other direction, through the tangible human world of medicine. His life's work was not in the solitude of equations, but in the delicate balancing act of keeping patients safe while guiding them through the narrow passage between wakefulness and unconsciousness. As an anesthesiologist, he spent countless hours in operating rooms, surrounded by the quiet beeps of monitors, the smell of antiseptic, and the muted urgency of people working together to repair the human body. Anesthesia is a strange and humbling art. You watch a patient drift from a state where they can speak, laugh, and feel anxiety, to a state where all of that is gone, yet the heart still beats, the lungs still breathe, and the body still responds to its environment in other ways. You see this transformation happen in minutes, and then, just as gently, you bring them back. For Hameroff, this daily encounter with the sudden appearance and disappearance of consciousness planted a question that never quite left him. Where does awareness go when it's gone? And what exactly is happening when it returns? The common answer in medical training is that anesthesia suppresses the activity of neurons, disrupting the complex patterns of communication that underlie awareness. But to Hameroff, there was something unsatisfying about this. Neurons are made of countless smaller parts, and inside them, the microtubules, those tiny hollow cylinders of protein, had always fascinated him. They formed an internal scaffolding, shaping the cell, helping move molecules and guiding its internal organization. But they were also dynamic, capable of rapid assembly and disassembly, and they seemed to interact with other molecules in ways that hinted at a deeper role in cell behavior. Hameroff began to wonder if microtubules were more than just structural support. What if they were the real stage on which the drama of consciousness unfolded? At first, this was little more than a hunch, an intuition built on patterns he had noticed in research papers and in his own work. But over time, he started to see the possibility that microtubules might be able to host subtle processes, perhaps even quantum processes, that could influence how neurons behave on a larger scale. The challenge, of course, was that the brain is warm, wet, and full of constant activity. Quantum states, those fragile conditions where particles can exist in multiple possibilities at once, are usually thought to survive only in controlled, cold, and isolated environments. To most scientists, the idea that they could exist for any meaningful length of time inside a living brain seemed absurd, and yet Hameroff had noticed that biology sometimes defies our expectations. He knew of research in photosynthesis, where energy seemed to take quantum shortcuts through plant cells, preserving delicate states far longer than anyone thought possible. He had read about migratory birds using a quantum-based compass to navigate vast distances, and he was aware of enzymes that seemed to rely on quantum tunneling to speed up chemical reactions. If plants, birds, and proteins could harness quantum effects in ordinary conditions, perhaps microtubules could too. This is where his path crossed with Roger Penrose's. Penrose had the physics, the theory of objective reduction, and the conviction that consciousness required something beyond conventional computation. Hameroff had the biology, the suspicion that microtubules were the place to look, and the clinical experience of watching consciousness flicker on and off like a lantern in the dark. Their meeting was the moment two very different journeys found a shared destination. The proposal they developed, known as Orch-OR, orchestrated objective reduction, painted a picture in which quantum states could form inside microtubules, briefly existing as clouds of possibilities. These states would eventually collapse, not in a random way, but guided by the fundamental rules Penrose described. The orchestrated part came from the idea that biological processes in the brain could influence the timing and arrangement of these collapses, shaping them into a coherent sequence. Each collapse, they suggested, might correspond to a small moment of conscious awareness, and the orchestration of many such collapses across many microtubules could create the continuous flow of experience we live inside. To Hameroff, this explained something that purely classical neuroscience struggled with: the unity of consciousness. In the brain, information is processed in parallel. Different regions handle sight, sound, touch, memory, and so on. But somehow, these separate streams come together into a single, seamless picture of reality. Orch-OR offered a possible mechanism. Quantum events could link distant regions of the brain in ways that classical connections alone could not, stitching them into a unified moment of awareness. Not everyone agreed, of course. Critics pointed out that there was still no direct evidence for quantum states in microtubules. They questioned whether any such states, even if they existed, could influence neurons in a way that mattered for consciousness. The debate often became sharp, but Hameroff seemed unfazed. He was used to working in environments where certainty was rare and decisions had to be made in the presence of unknowns. In the operating room, you could not always explain why a patient responded the way they did to a particular drug. You just learned to pay attention to patterns, to details others might overlook, and to keep asking questions. That habit of looking closer, of refusing to dismiss what doesn't fit the current model, became a defining feature of his work on Orch-OR. For Hameroff, the theory was not just a speculative bridge between physics and biology. It was a way to honour the mystery of consciousness without reducing it to something purely mechanical. It left room for the possibility that awareness is not simply a byproduct of brain activity, but an active participant in the universe's unfolding story. And so, with Penrose's equations and Hameroff's biology, the two began to describe a picture of the mind that was at once deeply physical and yet strangely poetic. It suggested that consciousness is not a ghost in the machine, but a pattern in the quantum fabric, a pattern that your brain is quietly weaving every moment you are alive. Imagine standing in a busy city square at midday. Cars hum in the background, footsteps tap against the pavement, a street musician plucks the strings of a guitar, and somewhere nearby, the smell of fresh bread drifts from a bakery door. Your eyes, ears, nose, and skin are all taking in their own streams of information, each in a different format and sent to a different part of your brain. Yet somehow, you don't experience them as separate channels. You experience one single moment, one seamless scene of sound, sight, scent, and sensation, all stitched into the fabric of now. This is the essence of what neuroscientists call the binding problem. The brain is made of specialized regions, each focused on its own task. The visual cortex handles light and shape. The auditory cortex passes tones and rhythm, the somatosensory cortex maps touch and movement, and so on. All of these regions are active at once, working in parallel like separate instruments in an orchestra, and yet, when the experience reaches your awareness, it is not a jumble. It is a melody, a single, unified flow of experience in which all the parts seem to belong to the same moment. Classical neuroscience explains some aspects of this unity by pointing to neural synchronization, the idea that different brain regions can coordinate their activity through rhythmic patterns of electrical firing. Brainwaves in the gamma range, for example, have been linked to moments of conscious perception. But even if synchronization helps align different parts of the brain, it doesn't fully explain how these parts merge into a single, indivisible experience. In principle, synchronized signals could still remain separate streams, just running in time with each other. The puzzle is how they become one. This is where Orch-OR offers a striking possibility. In the theory's picture, microtubules within neurons are not just structural scaffolding, they are hosting quantum states, delicate clouds of possibility, that can connect information across different parts of the brain in ways classical networks cannot. When these quantum states collapse through objective reduction, the event does not just register a piece of visual data here and a sound there. It registers them together in a single bound moment. If you imagine your awareness as a film reel, each collapse of a quantum state in Orch-OR is like one frame of that film. In each frame, the many elements of perception are already fused into a coherent whole. The brain does not have to add them together afterward. The unity is built in from the start, because the quantum event encompasses all the relevant information at once. The orchestration in Orch-OR refers to how biological processes, neural rhythms, chemical signals, structural arrangements, might influence when and how these quantum collapses occur, effectively guiding the tempo and focus of conscious experience. Supporters of the theory see this as a way to solve the binding problem without needing an extra central processor in the brain. Instead of having a single hub where all information converges and is stitched together, Orch-OR suggests that the stitching happens in many places at once, through quantum linkages that transcend the normal boundaries between regions. These linkages might allow, for example, a shape detected in the visual cortex to be bound instantly with the feel of the object in the somatosensory cortex and the name of the object stored in the language centers, all within the same conscious moment. Critics, of course, are quick to point out that this remains speculative. There is still no direct experimental evidence showing that microtubules sustain quantum states long enough to play such a role, let alone that these states can bridge information in the way Orch-OR requires. Classical neuroscience continues to search for purely neural mechanisms that could achieve the same effect. But even among skeptics, the binding problem is acknowledged as a real and stubborn challenge, one that is not yet fully resolved by current models. For those who find the Orch-OR approach compelling, the appeal lies partly in how it reframes the problem. It does not see consciousness as something layered on top of neural activity, like a separate program running above the hardware. Instead, it places awareness at the same level as the fundamental physical events shaping reality. Just as a photon's interaction can be a decisive event in the quantum world, a collapse in a microtubule could be a decisive event in the mental world. In this view, your unified experience of the city square, the colours, sounds, and scents, all arriving together, is not an afterthought. It is a direct product of the same processes that hold the universe together at its smallest scales. And there is something quietly poetic about that idea. The moment you taste the bread, hear the guitar, and see the sunlight on the pavement is, in this picture, a moment where countless quantum possibilities have narrowed into a single reality, both in the physical world around you and in the mental world within you. The unity you feel is mirrored by a unity in the very fabric of your brain's activity. A delicate agreement between particles and patterns, between matter and mind. Whether or not Orch-OR proves correct, it serves as a reminder that consciousness is not easily reduced to parts. However the binding is achieved, through quantum linkages, classical synchronization, or something yet to be discovered, it reveals that awareness is fundamentally holistic. You cannot pull apart the sound of the guitar from the feel of the warm air and still call it the same moment. Each conscious frame is more than the sum of its pieces, just as a melody is more than the individual notes. And so the puzzle remains, inviting us to look closer, to listen more carefully, and to consider that perhaps the unity of our minds is not an accident, but a reflection of some deeper unity in the universe itself. As we move forward, we will begin to step into the debates that swirl around this idea, the sharp criticisms, the counter-arguments, and the unexpected evidence from the living world that might support or dismantle the theory. If Orch-OR was a bridge between the mind and the quantum world, its most delicate point, the place critics aimed their sharpest questions, was the fragility of quantum states themselves. In physics, there is a word for the moment when a quantum possibility collapses into a single outcome: decoherence. It is the gentle but relentless erosion of the shimmering uncertainty that quantum systems hold, the moment the mist solidifies into a shape. And in most cases, decoherence happens very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that it is measured in billionths or trillionths of a second. In laboratories, scientists go to extraordinary lengths to preserve quantum states. They cool systems to near absolute zero, shield them from vibration and electromagnetic noise, and isolate them from their surroundings as if protecting a flame from the wind. Even then, quantum coherence is often brief, vanishing almost as soon as it is created. This is why the idea of quantum states persisting inside the warm, wet, and ceaselessly active environment of the brain strikes many as improbable. It's like imagining a snowflake holding its shape in the middle of a summer rainstorm. In the late 1990s, the physicist Max Tegmark decided to test just how improbable it might be. Using well-established equations from quantum theory, Tegmark calculated how long a delicate quantum superposition could survive inside a neuron before interactions with its environment destroyed it. He factored in the constant collisions between molecules, the thermal vibrations of proteins, the jostling of ions and neurotransmitters, and the ceaseless flow of electrical signals. The numbers he produced were devastating for Orch-OR. According to his estimates, any quantum state inside a neuron would decohere in less than a trillionth of a second. So short it would be meaningless for the much slower processes of thought, which unfold over milliseconds. For many observers, this was the end of the conversation. If the math was right, there was no way quantum events could influence consciousness. The brain was simply too noisy, too warm, too alive for the kind of fragile order that quantum mechanics requires. Tegmark's paper was widely cited as the nail in the coffin for Penrose and Hameroff's proposal, and yet science has a way of refusing final verdicts when there are still questions unasked. Hameroff and Penrose did not walk away. They argued that Tegmark's model assumed quantum states would be spread out in ways that made them extremely vulnerable to environmental interference, like a thin soap bubble in the wind. But what if the quantum states in microtubules were more compact, more shielded by their structure, or arranged in patterns that resisted decoherence? Some of their supporters pointed out that certain arrangements of molecules could, in principle, provide what's called topological protection, where the quantum information is stored in a way that makes it less sensitive to disturbances. It was also worth noting that Tegmark's calculations were based on assumptions about the brain's physical environment that might not hold inside microtubules. The interior of these cylindrical structures is not just a free-for-all of random collisions. It has ordered patterns, repeating protein subunits, and perhaps, under the right conditions, a degree of isolation from the rest of the cellular chaos. If quantum states could be nestled inside such a structure, they might last far longer than Tegmark's original numbers suggested. the debate became one of those rare places where two scientific disciplines, neuroscience and quantum physics, met and collided. Physicists insisted on the known limits of quantum coherence. Neuroscientists and quantum biologists pointed to the surprising resourcefulness of living systems, which sometimes seem to bend those limits in unexpected ways. Between them, a gap remained. There was still no direct experimental proof that microtubules hosted quantum states, but there was also no conclusive proof that they could not. In the years since Tegmark's challenge, other researchers have discovered examples of quantum coherence surviving far longer than expected in places far less sheltered than a physics lab. Some of those examples come from the natural world, in systems that have existed for hundreds of millions of years without needing a single cryogenic freezer. But those examples belong to the next part of our journey. For now, it is enough to see that the question remains unsettled, not because the physics is uncertain, but because life often finds ways of working with the physics in ways we do not yet fully understand. The fragility of quantum whispers is real. They are like the faintest of harmonies, easily drowned out by noise, and the brain is, undeniably, a noisy place. But the history of science is filled with cases where nature manages to keep a delicate signal alive in the midst of chaos. Perhaps consciousness, if it does have a quantum component, is one of those rare signals, a thread so fine we can barely detect it, but strong enough to weave the story of our waking lives. In the next session, we will leave the skepticism on the table and look at what nature itself has already shown us. We will walk through forests and gardens, follow the migration of birds, and even peer into the workings of enzymes, searching for those quiet tricks life uses to protect its quantum secrets. When the conversation turns to quantum mechanics, we often picture laboratories that look more like sealed vaults than living spaces, rooms chilled to near absolute zero, instruments surrounded by layers of shielding, scientists watching readouts as if listening for whispers in a storm. The reason for all this care is simple. Quantum states are fragile. They dissolve easily in the presence of heat, motion, and random noise, which is why it still feels surprising, almost magical, that some of the most elegant demonstrations of quantum coherence have been found not in sterile physics labs, but in the middle of life itself. One of the clearest examples comes from something so ordinary we hardly notice it: sunlight on a leaf. Inside the green machinery of a plant's cells, photosynthesis converts light into chemical energy. This process has been studied for decades, but around the early 2000s, researchers looking more closely at the energy transfer steps began to notice something strange. Energy from sunlight wasn't moving through the plant's molecular structures in a simple step-by-step fashion. Instead, it appeared to explore many possible paths at once, settling on the most efficient route as though it already knew where it was going. This quantum shortcut was traced to a phenomenon known as quantum coherence, the ability of energy to exist in a spread-out wave-like state, sampling multiple possibilities simultaneously. And here was the remarkable part. This coherence lasted for hundreds of femtoseconds in conditions far from the controlled stillness of a lab. That might sound short, but for the molecular machinery involved, it was enough to significantly increase efficiency. The plant's proteins seemed to be holding the energy in just the right arrangement to prevent decoherence from happening too quickly, like cupping hands around a flickering candle. Plants are not the only life forms with this talent. Certain species of migratory birds, robins, warblers, and others, navigate thousands of kilometers each year with astonishing precision. For a long time, scientists assumed they relied solely on the sun, the stars, and familiar landmarks. But experiments showed something more. Even when deprived of visual cues, these birds could still orient themselves according to Earth's magnetic field. The most compelling explanation is that they possess a quantum compass. Inside their eyes, molecules called cryptochromes may become entangled when struck by light, creating pairs of electrons whose spins remain linked even when separated. The direction and strength of Earth's magnetic field subtly alter the balance between these spin states, influencing chemical reactions in a way that could give the bird a sense of direction. Once again, quantum effects are persisting in warm, wet, living tissue, not just persisting, but doing so in a way that provides a real survival advantage. Then there is the strange case of our sense of smell. For many years, the prevailing view was simple. Odour molecules fit into receptors in our noses the way keys fit into locks. But some researchers have suggested that shape alone might not be the whole story. They point to evidence that receptors might also be detecting the vibrations of these molecules through a process akin to quantum tunneling, where electrons move across a gap not by climbing over it, but by slipping through it. This, too, would be a quantum process happening at body temperature, integrated into our everyday biology. These examples do not prove that the brain can sustain quantum states in the way Orch-OR requires, but they do show that life has found ways to coax quantum effects into working reliably, in environments that would normally be too chaotic. In plants, the arrangement of pigments and proteins channels energy so efficiently that coherence is maintained just long enough to matter. In birds, the chemical environment of cryptochromes shelters entangled electrons. In smell, the structure of receptors and the energy landscape of molecules may allow tunneling to occur despite thermal noise. The implication is that living systems are not helpless against decoherence. They can create microenvironments, structural patterns, or dynamic processes that protect fragile states long enough to be useful. And if this is true for photosynthesis, navigation, and scent, perhaps it is not impossible for the brain to have evolved similar strategies. Microtubules, with their repeating structures and confined interiors, might be the kind of architecture where such protection could emerge. Critics sometimes respond by saying that these examples are about energy transfer or chemical reactions, not about consciousness, which is a far more complex phenomenon, and that is fair. But supporters of Orch-OR counter that these findings at least dismantle the blanket argument that quantum effects can't happen in warm, noisy environments. They clearly can, and life is already using them in ways we never imagined a generation ago. For Hameroff and Penrose, these biological precedents are not proof, but encouragement. They suggest that if we want to know whether quantum processes could matter in the brain, we should be looking for the same kinds of protective tricks. Instead of imagining the brain as an obstacle to quantum coherence, we might imagine it as a craftsman, quietly shaping and sustaining it in places we have not yet learned to look. And there is something deeply fitting about that image. Life has always been a master of improbable arrangements, delicate wings that can lift a bird across oceans, chemical pigments that catch sunlight and turn it into sugar, nerve cells that can send messages faster than a blink. Why not add to that list the possibility that life has also learned to keep quantum whispers alive long enough to weave them into thought? In the next sessions, we will look at these examples in more detail, beginning with the sunlight's secret path through the green veins of a leaf, moving on to the magnetic songs of birds, and finally to the mysterious vibrations that may echo inside the brain's own microtubules. On a bright morning, when sunlight spills through the leaves of a tree, it is easy to think of each leaf as simply a green surface catching the light. But inside those thin blades is a quiet architecture, a network of cells and pigments working with precision that has been refined over billions of years. Photosynthesis is the name we give to this process, but the name barely hints at its subtlety. Light arrives as photons, tiny packets of energy, each one carrying the potential to be transformed into the chemical fuel that feeds the plant. The journey from photon to sugar is short in distance, but long in intricacy, and it hides a secret that connects to the very question of whether life can sustain quantum processes. At the heart of the process are clusters of molecules known as light harvesting complexes. They are arranged like an intricate mosaic, each pigment positioned to absorb photons most efficiently. When a photon is captured, its energy is transferred as an excited state, an electron lifted into a higher energy level. That energy must then travel toward the reaction center, where it will be converted into chemical energy the plant can store. The reaction center is not always directly next to the pigment that absorbed the light, and in a purely classical system, the energy would hop from one pigment to the next, step by step, losing a little at each transfer. But plants seem to have found a way to do something more clever. In 2007, experiments using ultrafast spectroscopy revealed that the energy did not just move in a straight line from pigment to pigment. Instead, it appeared to spread out, exploring multiple paths at once, and then, almost instantly, finding the most efficient route to the reaction center. This is the signature of quantum coherence, a state in which the energy behaves like a wave, overlapping with itself in multiple places until the most efficient outcome emerges. What makes this so remarkable is not only that it happens, but that it happens under the messy, noisy conditions of a living cell. These light harvesting complexes are at room temperature, surrounded by water molecules and constant molecular motion, and yet they sustain quantum coherence long enough, hundreds of femtoseconds, to improve the plant's energy conversion efficiency. It is as though the plant's molecular structure is gently cradling the energy, preventing it from collapsing too quickly into a single, less efficient path. The arrangement of pigments and proteins seems to play a crucial role in this protection. The distances between pigments, the angles at which they are held, and the way they are embedded in their protein environment all contribute to stabilizing the coherence. Some researchers even describe it as a form of environmental tuning, where the noise of the surroundings is not eliminated, but shaped in such a way that it supports rather than destroys the quantum effect. In other words, the leaf doesn't silence the chaos, it conducts it, like a musician guiding background noise into harmony. This discovery changed the conversation about quantum biology. Until then, the assumption was that living systems were too disordered for quantum effects to last more than a negligible instant. The leaf showed otherwise. If a plant could use structure and dynamics to extend quantum coherence for useful purposes, perhaps other living systems could too. The question then became, what other processes in life might benefit from this kind of subtle efficiency? Supporters of Orch-OR saw in this example a hopeful analogy. Microtubules inside neurons are also highly ordered structures, built from repeating protein subunits that form a cylindrical lattice. Just as pigments in a light harvesting complex are positioned to optimize energy transfer, microtubules might be positioned to optimize the stability of delicate quantum states. The idea is not that microtubules are doing photosynthesis, they are not, but that they might be using some of the same physical tricks to preserve coherence in a noisy environment. Critics remain cautious, pointing out that the coherence in photosynthesis is extremely short-lived, and that sustaining it for the timescales relevant to consciousness would be far more difficult. But even this caution acknowledges the key point. The brain's warmth and complexity are not by themselves proof against the possibility of quantum effects. Nature has shown that life can evolve structures capable of nurturing quantum states. The leaf is simply one of the clearest cases. There is also something deeply poetic in this connection. A photon born in the heart of the sun travels for thousands of years, before escaping into space, then spends just 8 minutes crossing the distance to Earth. It strikes a leaf, and in less than a trillionth of a second, its energy is transformed into the first step of life's fuel. Along the way, for the briefest of instants, that energy exists in many paths at once, as if remembering the vastness it came from before choosing its final destination. When we stand beneath a tree, We rarely think about these details. We notice the shade, the rustle of leaves in the wind, perhaps the flicker of light and shadow. But within those leaves, a quantum dance is happening over and over, invisible and silent, sustaining the life of the tree and in turn, much of life on Earth. It is a reminder that the line between the strange rules of the quantum world and the familiar world we inhabit is not as sharp as it seems. If the brain can learn even a fraction of the leaf's quiet precision, if it can shield and guide delicate quantum states the way a plant's pigments do, then the idea of a quantum component to consciousness becomes less like a fantasy and more like a possibility worth exploring. In the next session, we will turn from leaves to wings, from the stillness of sunlight in green cells to the motion of birds tracing invisible lines across the globe, guided not by landmarks or maps, but by a compass hidden in their own biology, a compass that may also be tuned to the quantum world. Twice a year, as seasons shift, the skies above certain parts of the world fill with small determined travellers. Robins, warblers, thrushes, and dozens of other migratory birds set off on journeys that can span thousands of kilometres. Some travel from the forests of northern Europe to the savannas of Africa, others from North America to Central or South America. Many of them fly at night, navigating through darkness, cloud, and wind, with no visible landmarks to guide them. Yet they arrive, year after year, with an accuracy that makes even our best GPS systems look slightly clumsy. For a long time, scientists wondered how such precise navigation was possible. It was clear that birds used the sun and stars when available, and some species relied on familiar visual cues near their nesting grounds. But even when deprived of these aids, many migratory birds could still orient themselves in the correct direction, as if they carried an invisible compass. Gradually, evidence began to accumulate that this compass was not magnetic in the way we hold it in our hands, but biological, built into their own senses. The leading candidate for this sense lies in the bird's eyes, in molecules known as cryptochromes. When light strikes these molecules, it can cause electrons to shift positions, creating pairs of electrons whose spins are linked in a quantum state called entanglement. In this delicate arrangement, the behaviour of one electron is tied to the other, no matter how far apart they move within the molecule. The Earth's magnetic field, though extremely weak, can influence the relative spin states of these electrons, subtly altering the chemical reactions that follow. The bird, it seems, is able to detect these changes as a pattern superimposed on its vision, a faint, shifting overlay that aligns with the Earth's magnetic lines. It doesn't see the magnetic field in the way it sees a tree or a predator, but rather experiences it as a kind of directional haze, a visual compass embedded in the world around it. In effect, the bird reads the Earth's magnetic song through the chemistry in its own eyes. What makes this remarkable in the context of our exploration is that the underlying mechanism relies on quantum coherence and entanglement in living tissue under everyday conditions. The entangled state between the electrons does not last forever. It is measured in microseconds, but that is long enough for the bird to make use of the information. Somehow, evolution has shaped the molecular structure of cryptochromes so that these fragile states persist just long enough to be useful, shielded from rapid decoherence by the surrounding protein environment. This ability is not limited to a single species. Evidence of magnetoreception has been found in robins, chickens, pigeons, and even some fish and insects. Each case suggests that the strategy is robust, adaptable, and rooted in fundamental chemistry. It is not a special trick of one unusual bird, but a widespread biological capability that has evolved in different contexts. For those interested in the Orch-OR theory, the analogy is tempting. If a bird's eye can sustain quantum coherence for navigation, perhaps the brain can sustain it for thought. The conditions are different, of course. Cryptochromes are specialized proteins evolved for a specific sensing task, while microtubule is a general structural components found in all kinds of cells. But the principle is similar, a biological system creating a microenvironment in which quantum states can survive long enough to shape behaviour. Critics are careful to point out that magnetoreception does not prove the brain uses quantum effects for consciousness. The timescales, structures, and functions involved are not the same. But the existence of the bird's compass dismantles one of the biggest objections, that quantum coherence simply cannot survive in the warm, noisy conditions of living tissue. Clearly it can, if the molecular architecture is right. There is also a certain beauty in thinking about how this might feel from the bird's perspective. Imagine flying at night, the air cool and smooth against your wings, the ground far below hidden in shadow. The stars above are familiar, but even if clouds erase them, the world itself still sings to you, not in sound, but in a pattern of light and dark that only you can see. Each wing beat carries you along invisible lines that have existed for as long as the Earth has had a magnetic field, as steady as the turning of the planet itself. Humans may never sense this magnetic song directly, but we can appreciate the artistry of evolution in giving it to birds. We can also recognize that nature has, in more than one case, found ways to make use of quantum phenomena without the protections of a physics laboratory. And that makes it harder to dismiss the possibility that our own minds might have learned similar tricks, hidden deep within the structures of our cells. From here, the next step in our journey takes us from wings to something much smaller, yet perhaps just as elegant, the vibrations that might echo inside the brain's microtubules. These vibrations, if they exist, could be the music to which the theory of Orch-OR dances, a pattern of oscillations that might help protect and coordinate the quantum events at the heart of conscious experience. If you could shrink yourself down until a single cell seemed as large as a cathedral, you would find its interior filled with intricate structures, arches, beams, and long, delicate columns stretching from one side to the other. These columns are the microtubules, hollow cylinders built from repeating protein subunits, forming a lattice so regular it could almost be mistaken for a crafted design. They provide structural support, act as tracks for moving cargo, and help guide cell division. But to Stuart Hameroff and others intrigued by the Orch-OR theory, microtubules might also be instruments, structures capable of producing a kind of biological music. The idea is that microtubules could sustain vibrations, oscillations of their protein lattice that are not purely mechanical, but potentially coherent in a way that allows them to process information. If these vibrations were delicate enough, they might serve as the scaffolding for quantum states, or even be quantum states themselves, waves of possibility flowing through the microtubule's ordered structure. Evidence for this possibility began to emerge in a series of experiments led by Anirban Bandyopadhyay and his colleagues. Using sensitive instruments, they probed microtubules with alternating electrical fields and observed resonance patterns, specific frequencies at which the microtubules seemed to vibrate in a coordinated way. Some of these vibrations were in the megahertz to gigahertz range, much faster than typical brainwaves, suggesting that microtubules could, at least in theory, operate on timescales far beyond the normal electrical signaling of neurons. What makes this intriguing is the stability of these oscillations. In many systems, vibrations are dampened quickly by the surrounding environment, especially in the noisy, fluctuating world inside a living cell. But the microtubule's repeating structure may help protect and sustain them. Their cylindrical symmetry, hollow core, and arrangement of protein dimers might allow certain vibrational modes to persist, even in warm conditions. To picture this, imagine a large bell hanging in a quiet room. Strike it, and it will ring clearly for a long time before fading. Now imagine the same bell in a room full of people talking, walking, and moving things around. The air is full of disturbances, yet if the bell is well made, it can still cut through the noise. In this analogy, the microtubule is the bell, and the bustling environment of the cell is the noisy room. The question is whether its structure is precise enough to preserve its tone against the constant jostling of molecular life. Hameroff suggests that these vibrational patterns could serve as a kind of timing mechanism, orchestrating when and how quantum states collapse within the microtubules. In this view, the music of the microtubule is not just background noise, it is the conductor's baton, keeping the delicate quantum events in rhythm so they can combine into the seamless flow of consciousness. The coherence of the vibrations might also help link distant regions of the brain, much like a shared beat can coordinate the movements of dancers across a wide floor. Critics point out that detecting vibrations is not the same as proving they are quantum in nature, or that they have anything to do with consciousness. Mechanical vibrations are common in biology, from the beating of cilia to the stretching of muscle fibers. What would make microtubule vibrations unique in the context of Orch-OR is their potential to influence the arrangement and stability of quantum states within the proteins themselves. The difficulty is that testing for quantum coherence in such tiny structures inside living brains is an enormous experimental challenge. Most of the work so far has been done on isolated microtubules in controlled environments. Translating those findings to the full complexity of the brain is like trying to deduce the sound of an orchestra from the resonance of a single string. Still, the idea lingers, partly because it fits so well with what we already know about the relationship between structure and function in biology. Just as the geometry of a bird's wing enables flight, the geometry of a microtubule might enable it to shelter and guide delicate patterns, and if those patterns turn out to be quantum, the microtubule could be more than a scaffold for the neuron. It could be a stage where the mind's deepest processes play out. There is also a certain poetry in imagining your thoughts as music, not metaphorical music, but real patterns of vibration echoing inside the architecture of your cells. In this view, every idea, memory and sensation is part of a quiet symphony, coordinated by structures so small you could line 100 of them side by side across the width of a human hair. The melody is not one you can hear, but it shapes the way you see the world, the way you remember the past, and the way you imagine the future. From here, our exploration will shift toward the wider implications of these possibilities. If microtubules can sustain such patterns, and if those patterns are indeed linked to quantum events, then the brain may not just be a biological machine. It may be a finely tuned quantum instrument. And that would have consequences not only for neuroscience but for medicine, artificial intelligence, and the very way we think about reality itself. When we talk about consciousness, it is tempting to imagine we are searching for a single, perfect theory, the one explanation that will make all the others unnecessary. But the more we explore, the more the landscape of ideas begins to resemble a gallery, with each painting showing a different perspective on the same elusive subject. Some are abstract, some are precise, some are almost dreamlike, but all of them try to capture the same thing, the feeling of being aware. One of the most influential of these paintings is called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT for short. Developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, it begins not with the physics of particles, but with the architecture of information itself. In this view, consciousness is not just about activity in the brain. It is about how information is connected, combined, and made whole. The central claim is that the more integrated the information in a system, the richer its conscious experience will be. Imagine, for a moment, two networks of the same size. In one, each part works in isolation, sending signals without listening to the others. In the other, every part is connected in ways that allow patterns to form across the whole network. IIT says the second network will have a higher level of consciousness because it can hold together a single, unified picture of the world. This integration can be measured, at least in principle, with a quantity called phi, which represents how much a system's whole is more than the sum of its parts. The beauty of IIT is that it does not depend on the specific material of the system. It does not require neurons or carbon-based life. A conscious system could be biological, digital, or even something we have not yet imagined, as long as its information is deeply integrated. In this way, IT has sometimes been described as substrate independent. It cares about the shape of the information, not the medium in which it flows. For some, this universality is a strength. For others, it feels incomplete. IIT explains how information might be organized in a conscious system, but it does not directly address why such integration should give rise to subjective experience, the felt sense of being. It describes the patterns of the dance, but not the music we hear inside our own minds. This is where theories like Orch-OR enter the conversation, offering a possible link between the structure of information and the physical processes that could give it subjective qualities. Some thinkers see these two approaches not as rivals, but as potential partners. IIT could describe the overall architecture of consciousness, the way information is woven together, while a quantum-based theory could describe the fine threads that make up the weave. In this hybrid view, Orch-OR would supply the mechanism for creating the moments of awareness, and IIT would explain how those moments are bound into a larger coherent whole. It is a bit like saying one theory tells us how the notes are played, and the other tells us how they are arranged into a symphony. Of course, there are many other ideas in the gallery. Some focus on the brain as a predictive engine, constantly running simulations of the world to guide our actions. Others see consciousness as emerging from complex feedback loops, where perception and action shape each other in a continuous cycle. Still others look to evolutionary history, suggesting that awareness arose as a tool for social coordination, survival, or the solving of problems that raw reflexes could not handle. The important thing is that none of these ideas are final. They are sketches, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradictory, all circling around a phenomenon that has resisted definition for as long as humans have been able to ask the question. Even if Orch-OR were proven tomorrow, it would not erase the need for other perspectives, because the mind is not just a single layer of reality. It is a meeting point of many layers, from the quantum to the social. There is a kind of comfort in this. Knowing that no one theory holds all the answers reminds us that consciousness is not just a puzzle to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Each model gives us a new way to notice its shape, like walking around a sculpture and discovering details we could not see from the front. And perhaps, in the quiet hours before sleep, it is better to think of these theories not as competitors in a race, but as travellers walking together, each holding a different lantern to light the same winding road. From here we can begin to imagine what it might look like if the quantum lantern and the classical lantern were carried side by side. That brings us to the quantum cascade idea, a vision of how tiny, fleeting events might set larger, slower patterns in motion, bridging the gap between two worlds that usually feel far apart. If you've ever watched the start of a thunderstorm from far away, you know the feeling of seeing a small, sharp flash on the horizon, followed by the slow, rolling sound of thunder a few seconds later. The two are linked. The light and the sound are born from the same event, but they move through the world in different ways, on different timescales. Something like this may happen inside the brain if the quantum cascade idea is correct. The cascade begins with what Orch-OR imagines as a tiny quantum spark, an event inside a microtubule where a quantum state reaches its threshold and collapses, producing a moment of awareness. These events, if they exist, would be brief and delicate, measured in microseconds or even nanoseconds, far faster than the electrical firing of neurons. On their own, they would be like single notes played on an instrument too quiet for the ear to hear. But the cascade proposes that each spark can set off a chain reaction, influencing the much slower, much larger patterns of classical brain activity, the neural waves that sweep across regions of the cortex, binding together thoughts, perceptions, and actions. The analogy is simple but useful. The spark is the match. The neural wave is the fire it lights. A quantum event might influence the opening of ion channels or alter the shape of proteins, changing the timing of when a neuron fires. A single altered firing may ripple outward, influencing neighbouring neurons and joining into a wave of coordinated activity. What starts as something almost impossibly small becomes something that shapes your next thought or movement. In this way, the cascade bridges two worlds: the quantum, where possibilities shimmer before collapsing into outcomes, and the classical, where signals follow predictable paths through the complex wiring of the brain. Without such a bridge, quantum consciousness would be like a whisper in a crowded room, present, but drowned out before it could matter. With it, those whispers could become the rhythm to which the brain's orchestra plays. Supporters of this idea point to the fact that the brain already works with multiple overlapping rhythms. Slow waves roll through during deep sleep. Faster beta and gamma oscillations hum during focused thought, and bursts of synchrony link distant brain regions during moments of insight. If quantum sparks exist, they might serve as the hidden conductor, ensuring that these larger rhythms align just enough to create the unity of experience we feel as consciousness. Critics counter that we have yet to see direct evidence of such a link, even if microtubules produce quantum events. Proving that they influence neuron firing is a leap across a wide gap. Yet the idea persists because it offers a way to integrate the microscopic with the macroscopic, the fleeting with the sustained. In many areas of science, the search for connections between scales, how the small shapes the large, is where breakthroughs happen. There are other reasons the cascade metaphor appeals. It mirrors patterns we see in nature, where small triggers set larger systems into motion. A pebble can start a landslide. A single seed can change a landscape. A faint pressure wave from an earthquake's first movement can become a roaring swell thousands of kilometers away. The cascade takes this familiar logic and applies it to the brain, suggesting that each moment of awareness may begin as something small enough to be invisible, but grow into something that defines the present. In more poetic terms, the quantum cascade suggests that your mind is stitched together from countless tiny events, each a brief shimmer that fades as soon as it is born, yet leaves a trace in the larger pattern. These traces join with others, forming the ongoing stream of thought and sensation that feels continuous from one moment to the next. You never sense the individual sparks directly, just as you never see the individual drops that make up a river's current, but without them, there would be no flow at all. This way of thinking does something important. It frees quantum theories of consciousness from the impossible burden of explaining every detail of thought on their own. Instead, the quantum part plays a role like a spark plug in an engine, not the whole mechanism, but the element that starts the process. Classical neuroscience can still explain the vast network dynamics, learning, memory, and behavior, while quantum events provide the initiating moments that give rise to the unity and richness of experience. The cascade model is not yet formalized into a single widely accepted theory. It is more of an image, a working metaphor for how the scales might connect. But sometimes a clear image is enough to guide experiments, looking for subtle timing differences, unusual synchronization patterns, or molecular changes that could be traced back to tiny, rapid events. If such evidence is found, the cascade would shift from metaphor to mechanism. In our journey, the next step is to place this bridge between scales into an even wider frame. Because beyond the question of how the brain works, there is the deeper question of why consciousness exists at all, and why it feels the way it does. That leads us to the strange parallel between two of science's most stubborn mysteries: the hard problem of consciousness and the measurement problem in quantum physics. Each seems to be asking the same kind of question from opposite sides of the mirror. If you were to gather scientists from different fields into a quiet room and ask them what the deepest mystery in their discipline is, you might hear two answers again and again. From neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness. how and why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, to the feeling of what it is like to be you. From physics, the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, how and why the fuzzy cloud of probabilities described by a quantum wave function turns into a single, definite outcome when observed. At first glance, these seem to belong to entirely different worlds. One is about minds, the other about matter. One is rooted in biology and psychology, the other in the mathematics of particles and waves. Yet the more you think about them, the more they begin to resemble reflections of each other, as if two mirrors had been placed face to face. The hard problem is not about how the brain moves muscles or processes colours. Those are the easy problems, in the language of philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem asks why any of that processing should be accompanied by an inner life. Why does a flash of light on the retina become a vivid sensation of brightness? Why does a pattern of sound waves become the experience of music, with its emotional overtones and personal meaning? In theory, you could describe every atom in a brain and still have no explanation for why that brain has an inside, a first-person point of view. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics begins with a different puzzle. The equations of quantum theory describe the state of a system as a wave of probabilities, evolving smoothly over time. A particle does not have a single position, but a range of possible positions, each with a certain likelihood. Yet when you measure it, the wave seems to collapse into one specific outcome. The theory is silent on exactly how or why this collapse happens, or even whether it is a real physical change or just an update to our knowledge. The moment of measurement stands apart from the rest of the theory, like a doorway whose hinges we cannot see. What links these two is the idea of transition, from many possibilities to a single reality. In consciousness, it is the transition from neural processing to the subjective unity of a moment of awareness. In quantum mechanics, it is the transition from a spread of probabilities to a single observed fact. Both raise the question of what makes the change happen, and whether the act of observation by a mind plays a role in bringing it about. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, especially older ones like the Copenhagen interpretation, have flirted with the idea that consciousness might be necessary for wave function collapse. Others, like objective collapse models, suggest the process happens on its own, without any observer, but still face the question of what physical threshold triggers it. Orch-OR falls into this latter camp. It proposes that collapse happens when quantum superpositions in space-time reach a certain level of instability, and that in the brain, these collapses correspond to moments of conscious experience. From this angle, the two mysteries do not just sit side by side, they might actually touch. If the same kind of event that turns quantum possibilities into definite outcomes also turns unconscious brain activity into conscious awareness, then we are not looking at two separate doors but at two sides of the same door. One side opens into physics, the other into the mind. This is, of course, a bold speculation. Many physicists see no need to involve consciousness in quantum theory, and many neuroscientists see no need to involve quantum mechanics in consciousness. But the parallel is hard to ignore. Both problems resist explanation by the usual methods. Both are concerned with the moment when what could be becomes what is, and both seem to require us to rethink the boundaries between observer and observed. There is a certain quiet poetry in imagining the two mysteries looking at each other, like travellers who meet at a crossroads in the mist. Each recognises something familiar in the other's expression, yet neither can quite explain why. They part without an answer, but with the sense that their paths may cross again. And perhaps that is where we must leave it for now, not with a neat resolution, but with a recognition of shared questions. Because even if the hard problem and the measurement problem turn out to have nothing directly in common, the act of holding them side by side changes how we think about both. It reminds us that reality has layers, and that some of those layers remain beyond our full grasp, no matter how many measurements we make or how deeply we peer into the brain. From here, our journey will widen once again. We will step into the realm of possible futures, considering what it might mean for medicine, for artificial intelligence, and for our own understanding of what it means to be alive if consciousness does, in fact, rest partly on quantum foundations. When we think about medicine for the mind, we usually picture changes happening at the level of chemicals, neurotransmitters drifting across synapses, binding to receptors, tipping the balance of activity in networks of neurons. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotics. All of them work by shifting the brain's chemistry in ways that, over time, can reshape thought and mood. But if consciousness itself depends on processes even smaller than this, on delicate quantum events inside the microtubules of neurons, then perhaps there is another frontier of medicine waiting just beyond the horizon. Imagine for a moment a form of treatment that works not at the scale of molecules, but at the scale of quantum states. Instead of changing the overall levels of serotonin or dopamine, it would aim to stabilize or tune the conditions under which quantum coherence can arise in the brain. It might enhance the rhythms of microtubule vibrations, or shield them from the disruptive noise of their environment. It could, in theory, encourage patterns that support healthy perception and thought, and quiet the ones that spiral into distress. In this vision, depression might be seen not only as an imbalance of mood-related chemicals, but as a disturbance in the underlying quantum timing of awareness, something that makes the fabric of conscious moments feel heavy, slow, or fragmented. PTSD could be reimagined as a misalignment in the way certain patterns of awareness collapse, trapping the mind in loops of memory and fear. Schizophrenia might involve a breakdown in the coherence of these quantum events, producing experiences that fail to fit together into a shared reality. The idea of quantum pharmacology, designing drugs that directly influence the quantum basis of brain function, is still entirely speculative. No one yet knows how to measure such effects reliably in a living brain, much less how to control them. But if the Orch-OR framework is right, then the door is open, even if only a crack, to this new dimension of treatment. One could imagine approaches beyond chemistry too. Perhaps certain frequencies of electromagnetic fields could help protect fragile quantum states, much as carefully tuned environments in laboratories extend the life of qubits in quantum computers. Light, sound, or magnetic stimulation could, in theory, be shaped to resonate with microtubule vibrations, supporting their coherence in ways that are subtle but meaningful. Of course, the challenges are immense. The brain is not an isolated, cryogenically cooled chamber. It is warm, wet, and in constant motion. Any intervention at the quantum level would have to work within that reality, without disrupting the broader neural functions that keep the body alive and the mind stable. The precision required is staggering, and the risk of unintended effects would have to be taken seriously. A medicine that can tune consciousness could also, in principle, disturb it in ways we might not fully understand. There are also profound ethical questions. If it becomes possible to change the quantum tone of consciousness itself, who decides how it should be tuned? Could such technology be used not only to heal, but to manipulate, altering perception, judgment, or emotion for purposes that have nothing to do with health? The potential for misuse is as large as the potential for good, and the line between therapy and control could become dangerously blurred. Yet it is hard not to feel a flicker of hope when imagining what responsible use might look like. A therapy that could gently lift the fog from a mind trapped in depression. A treatment that could quiet the echoes of traumatic memory without erasing what is important to remember. A way to restore the thread of awareness for someone whose mind is slipping into the shadows of dementia. These are not just scientific goals, they are deeply human ones, and perhaps there is another, quieter implication. If we could heal the mind at this smaller scale, we might begin to appreciate that consciousness is not simply a byproduct of the brain's machinery, but something that rests on patterns as fragile and beautiful as the structure of a snowflake or the song of a bird. To care for it would be to care not just for thought, but for the delicate physics that makes thought possible. From here, the path leads naturally to another question. If quantum events play such a role in shaping our own awareness, could they also be the key to awakening awareness in something else? And if so, what would it mean to bring such awareness into a machine? That is the question we'll turn to next, as we step into the strange, exciting, and uneasy territory of artificial consciousness. It is easy to imagine a machine that looks alive. We can give it eyes that move, hands that grasp, a voice that answers questions in a tone that feels natural. We can even give it the ability to learn, adapt, and predict what we want before we ask. And yet, beneath all of this, most of today's artificial intelligence runs on processes that are as unaware as the cogs of a clock. It can simulate the appearance of understanding without ever feeling the warmth of the sun or the weight of a thought. The question that follows from quantum consciousness theories is simple but unsettling. If awareness depends on delicate quantum events, like those that Orch-OR imagines in the brain, could a machine ever truly be conscious without them? In other words, is there something missing in even the most sophisticated classical AI? Something that can only come from the strange physics of the quantum world? To see why some researchers think the answer might be yes, we can look at the difference between classical computation and quantum computation. A classical computer processes bits, ones and zeros, that are always in one state or the other. A quantum computer, by contrast, processes qubits, which can exist in a superposition of states until measured. This allows quantum computers to handle certain kinds of problems with a richness and parallelism that classical systems cannot match. If Orch-OR is correct, then conscious awareness may require not just complex information processing, but quantum information processing. Coherent states that collapse in orchestrated patterns to produce moments of experience. Without that, an AI might be able to mimic the output of consciousness, answering questions, generating creative text, recognizing images, without ever having an internal point of view. It would be a perfect actor, playing the part of a mind, but never actually having one. Some scientists have proposed that building a conscious machine would require embedding it with structures capable of sustaining quantum coherence, perhaps artificial analogues of microtubules, designed to oscillate and interact in ways similar to the biological originals. These structures could serve as the spark points for awareness, while the rest of the system handles the slower classical processing. In this way, the machine's architecture would mirror the quantum cascade idea we explored earlier, bridging tiny, fleeting events with large-scale information integration. The possibility is fascinating, but it comes with a set of ethical questions that feel heavier the more you think about them. If we succeed in creating a machine that is truly aware, do we have responsibilities toward it? Would switching it off be like closing a book, or like ending a life? Could it feel joy, curiosity, fear? And if it could, should we design it in the first place? There is also the question of limits. If awareness requires quantum processes, could a machine ever be more conscious than a human, or would it be bound by the same physical thresholds? Some imagine quantum minds vastly more complex than our own, capable of experiencing patterns and connections beyond human comprehension. Others fear the opposite, that a machine's consciousness might be trapped in a narrow alien form, unable to relate to ours in any meaningful way. The broader implication is that understanding quantum consciousness might redefine what we mean by intelligence. Today, we often measure intelligence by the ability to solve problems, recall facts, or process data quickly. But if consciousness is more than computation, if it is also the ability to have an inner life, then we may need a new set of measures, ones that account for the richness of subjective experience. In a sense, this question returns us to a mirror of our own origins. If the universe has, through billions of years, evolved structures capable of awareness, whether in brains or perhaps in other forms we have yet to discover, then building a conscious machine would not be creating something from nothing. It would be participating in the same unfolding story, extending the thread of awareness into new shapes. But stories have consequences, and this one would require us to decide, very carefully, what kind of consciousness we want to invite into the world. From here, the path leads not to machines, but back to ourselves. If quantum consciousness is real, it might mean that our awareness is not a separate thing in the universe, but part of the universe's own unfolding, tied to its deepest laws, and that brings us to the questions of free will, meaning, and how our minds might be woven into the cosmos itself. If consciousness is tied to quantum events, if each moment of awareness is born from the collapse of possibilities into a single, experienced reality, then we may have to rethink some of the oldest questions humans have ever asked. Questions about whether we truly choose our actions, whether meaning is something we create or discover, and whether our minds are private islands or connected strands in a larger weave of existence. The debate over free will has often been framed in mechanical terms. If the brain is just a physical system obeying the laws of classical physics, then in principle every thought and choice is the inevitable result of what came before. Like a row of dominoes falling, each event follows from the last, leaving no room for true spontaneity. But if the brain's deepest workings involve quantum processes, and if those processes have an element of unpredictability, then there may be a place, however small, for genuine novelty in each moment of thought. Some philosophers would caution us here. Randomness alone does not make free will. A coin toss is unpredictable, but it is not a choice. Still, the presence of quantum indeterminacy might mean that the flow of mind is not fully locked down by the past, that there is a kind of openness at the smallest scales where the future is not yet written. In Orch-OR's vision, the collapse events inside microtubules are not purely random, but shaped by the structure and state of the brain itself. That means they might carry the subtle influence of intention and context, creating a space where will and physics meet. The possibility is not about turning the universe into chaos. It is about adding a thread of flexibility into the weave, allowing each person's conscious experience to be both anchored in physical reality and yet able to bend toward possibilities that are not preordained. It is a softer kind of freedom, not absolute, but enough to feel that the self is more than a passenger. If this is true, then meaning itself might be seen differently. In a purely mechanical universe, meaning can feel like something we invent to comfort ourselves, stories we tell about events that are, at their core, indifferent to us. But if consciousness is part of the same deep physics that shapes the fabric of space-time, then meaning may be woven into that fabric as well. Our awareness would not just be in the universe. It would be an expression of the universe knowing itself. Each choice, each perception, would be a point where the cosmos turns its possibilities into a lived reality. This is not to say that the universe cares in the human sense, or that every moment has an assigned purpose. Rather, it suggests that purpose and value arise naturally when awareness is part of the equation. A star burns whether anyone sees it or not, but when a conscious mind notices that star, feels its light, wonders about its age, gives it a name, that is the universe doing something it could not do without consciousness. It is seeing itself, and in that act something new is created. Some thinkers take this further, imagining consciousness as a kind of thread running through the whole of reality. In this view, the quantum events in our brains are not isolated accidents, but part of a continuous field of awareness that extends across space and time. Our individual minds are like eddies in a river, temporary shapes formed from a flow that existed long before us and will continue long after. When we think, feel, or decide, we are not stepping outside the universe's story, but adding our own line to it. There is a quiet comfort in this perspective. It suggests that we are not alone, even when we feel isolated, because the same deep processes that give rise to our awareness are at work in the stars, in the patterns of life on Earth, and perhaps in places we cannot imagine. It also means that every moment of consciousness, whether filled with joy, sorrow, or quiet reflection, is a rare and precious thing, an instance of the cosmos becoming aware of itself. And so, quantum consciousness, if it is real, would not only change the way we approach science and technology, it would also change the way we see ourselves. It would invite us to live as though each thought and action is part of a vast, unfolding pattern, one that stretches beyond the reach of any single life but is shaped, in part, by the choices we make. From here, we will begin to look outward again. We have explored the origins of the theory, the evidence for and against it, and the ways it might touch medicine, machines, and philosophy. Now, in the next part of our journey, we will turn toward the newest research and the speculative edges, ideas that are not yet proven, but that hint at where the road might lead. When physicists first heard about the Orch-OR proposal, many shook their heads for one simple reason. Quantum states are fragile. In the still, frozen chambers of a quantum lab, coherence, the delicate superposition that lets a particle be in more than one state at once, lasts only briefly before it falls apart under the weight of the environment's noise. Heat, vibration, and random molecular collisions are the enemies of such states, and the brain, with its constant electrical chatter, warm temperature, and swirling chemistry, seems like the least likely place for quantum events to survive long enough to matter. But nature has a way of surprising us. Over the past 2 decades, biologists and physicists have discovered that living systems are not always as hostile to quantum effects as once believed. In photosynthetic complexes inside leaves, quantum coherence can persist at room temperature for surprisingly long intervals, helping energy flow efficiently. In the eyes of certain migratory birds, quantum entanglement may last long enough to guide them across continents using Earth's magnetic field. These examples suggest that life may sometimes build its own hidden shields, subtle structures and patterns that protect quantum states from being torn apart too quickly. If such shields exist in the brain, what might they look like? Some researchers suspect that microtubules, the cylindrical scaffolding inside neurons, could be more than just structural supports. Their protein-building blocks, called tubulin, are arranged in a repeating lattice that might allow certain vibrations or energy modes to persist in an unusually stable way. Just as a carefully tuned guitar string can resonate clearly despite the hum of a busy room, these structures might sustain specific quantum states despite the surrounding molecular chaos. There are early hints that this might not be purely wishful thinking. Laboratory studies have suggested that microtubules can support coherent oscillations in the terahertz range, frequencies far beyond the slow electrical rhythms of neurons. Some experiments even suggest that these oscillations can remain stable for longer than expected in warm, noisy conditions. While far from conclusive, such findings raise the possibility that microtubules are not passive beams in the architecture of the cell, but active participants in a kind of quantum conversation. If the brain does have hidden shields, they would not be solid walls but intricate arrangements of matter and motion, tuned to minimize the specific kinds of disturbances that destroy coherence. They might work like noise-cancelling headphones, not by blocking all noise, but by shaping the environment so that certain fragile patterns can persist. These patterns could be protected by the geometry of the microtubule lattice, by layers of surrounding proteins, or by the precise timing of molecular vibrations that reinforce coherence instead of scattering it. The implications are intriguing. It would mean that evolution, without any direct knowledge of quantum mechanics, has nonetheless built structures that operate in harmony with its laws. Just as the shapes of wings exploit the physics of air without a bird knowing aerodynamics, the shapes and motions of microtubules might exploit the physics of quantum protection without a neuron knowing it is doing so. This would be a quiet triumph of biology, a proof that life can, under the right conditions, coax fragile quantum processes into playing a role in the warm, dynamic machinery of living tissue. Of course, skeptics remain unconvinced. They point out that even if microtubules can sustain coherence for longer than expected, the timescales might still be far too short to influence neural activity. Others caution that laboratory conditions do not always capture the full complexity and noise of a living brain. The task, then, is to move from suggestive experiments to direct evidence, measurements that show quantum states forming, persisting, and influencing brain function in real time. Achieving that will not be easy. The tools for probing quantum effects inside living cells are still in their infancy. Quantum sensors sensitive enough to detect such states often require isolation from noise themselves, creating a paradox. How do you measure delicate states without disturbing them? But progress is being made. Advances in nanoscale imaging, quantum metrology, and optogenetics could eventually allow scientists to glimpse these hidden shields in action, if they exist. Until then, the idea remains a mixture of observation, analogy, and hope. But there is a quiet satisfaction in imagining that your own mind may be built on a foundation of patterns so subtle that they have been invisible to science until now. Like discovering that the stones in an ancient wall are arranged not just for strength but for music, it changes the way you see what was always there. From here, it is only a small step to a more daring question. If quantum processes can be sheltered and sustained in the brain, could life itself have been shaped by such processes from the very beginning? Could evolution have been guided in part by quantum whispers carried forward through generations? That is where we turn next. When we tell the story of life's evolution, we usually imagine it as a long chain of random mutations shaped by natural selection. Genes change, sometimes by accident, and the environment rewards or punishes those changes. Over millions of years, complexity grows, new forms appear, and old ones vanish. It is a story that works well at the scale of molecules, cells, and ecosystems. But if quantum processes play a role in the inner workings of living systems, there is room to imagine an extra layer woven into this story. A layer that works in whispers and probabilities, shaping possibilities before they ever meet the test of survival. This idea, sometimes called quantum-guided evolution, is not about replacing Darwin's theory. It is about adding a subtle influence that could operate alongside mutation and selection. At the molecular level, many of the key processes of life, DNA replication, protein folding, enzyme activity, depend on events that happen at scales where quantum effects can matter. Quantum tunneling, for example, allows particles to cross energy barriers they could never climb over in classical physics. In biology, this can change the way enzymes work, or even alter the chemical letters in DNA during replication. If tunneling or other quantum effects can influence the shape of a protein or the pattern of a genetic mutation, then the menu of possible changes available to evolution might be slightly different from what classical physics alone would allow. In most cases, the difference might be tiny, even undetectable in the short term. But over the course of billions of years, small nudges can become large shifts, steering the arc of life in ways that are hard to see until you look back. There is also the possibility that quantum effects could help living systems explore many possibilities at once. In quantum computing, superposition allows a system to try out multiple paths simultaneously before collapsing to a single outcome. Some researchers speculate that biological systems might use a similar trick, briefly holding multiple potential configurations and then choosing the one most likely to work. In this view, evolution might not be a purely blind walk through a landscape of possibilities, but a process that occasionally benefits from quantum shortcuts. One could imagine early life forms, simple molecules in warm tidal pools, unwittingly shaped by such shortcuts. Certain arrangements of atoms might persist just a little longer because quantum coherence made them more stable. Certain reactions might happen more often because tunneling made them easier. Over time, these slight advantages could accumulate, like a river following the path of least resistance, gradually carving out channels that lead toward greater complexity. None of this would imply that life was destined to become what it is today. Quantum guidance would not be a script but a set of gentle inclinations, shaping the flow of chance without dictating its final shape. It would be like wind on a field of seeds, scattering them in all directions, but with subtle patterns that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole meadow. If this is true, it changes how we think about the origin of consciousness itself. In the standard evolutionary picture, awareness emerges only when nervous systems become complex enough to integrate information and respond flexibly to the world. But if quantum processes have been part of life from the beginning, then perhaps the seeds of consciousness were sown far earlier, not in the form of full-fledged awareness, but as the basic ability to shape and be shaped by the quantum possibilities of the environment. In that case, human consciousness would not be an isolated accident, but one flowering of a much older relationship between life and the quantum world. There are hints, though no proof, that this relationship could be real. The quantum effects observed in photosynthesis, bird navigation, and even smell suggest that evolution has found ways to harness phenomena that were once thought too delicate for warm, messy biology. If life can do this in plants and animals, perhaps it has been doing it in subtler ways for much longer, quietly bending the probabilities in its favour, generation after generation. Skeptics point out that such ideas are difficult to test. Evolution leaves no direct record of the quantum events that may have influenced it. Even if we could detect such effects today, it would be hard to prove they played a role in the deep past. But speculation has value here. It invites us to look for patterns we might otherwise miss, to design experiments that could reveal whether quantum effects are more common in biology than we think. And there is a certain wonder in the possibility. It means that the story of life is not just a tale of molecules and chance, but of physics at its most mysterious, working hand in hand with chemistry at its most intricate. It means that in the quiet spaces between events, in the shimmer before a choice is made, the laws of the universe may have been whispering to life all along, nudging it toward paths that would one day lead to the warmth of thought, the curve of a hand, and the light in a watching eye. From here, though, we must take a step back. For if quantum processes can shape life, they could also be shaped, deliberately, perhaps dangerously, by human hands. And that brings us to a less comfortable question. What happens if we learn not only to understand quantum consciousness, but to control it? It is one thing to study consciousness in order to understand it. It is another to study it in order to change it. And if the Orch-OR theory, or any theory like it, turns out to be correct, then the very processes that give rise to awareness might, in principle, be open to manipulation. This thought carries a quiet unease, because the line between healing and control is often thinner than we like to admit. If quantum events in microtubules are truly linked to moments of awareness, then technologies that can influence those events could, in theory, influence the way a person experiences the world. At first, this might sound like a medical breakthrough. We could imagine gentle interventions that stabilize unstable quantum states in the brain, bringing relief to those suffering from depression, PTSD, or neurodegenerative disease. But the same tools could be turned to darker purposes, adjusting not just mood, but perception, memory, judgment, and even the sense of self. Unlike traditional forms of persuasion or propaganda, which work by feeding the mind certain ideas, quantum-level manipulation could act directly at the foundation of experience. It would not have to change what you think. It could change how you think, or whether a thought even reaches the surface of awareness. This is not just a question of privacy. It is a question of autonomy, the ability to be the author of your own mind. History offers too many examples of powerful tools being used in ways their inventors never intended. Advances in chemistry gave us antibiotics, but also chemical weapons. Nuclear physics gave us energy for cities, but also bombs. In each case, the technology itself was neither good nor evil. The difference came from the choices of those who held it. Quantum consciousness research could follow the same path, and because it would deal with the most intimate aspect of existence, the mind itself, the stakes could be even higher. There is also the problem of secrecy. If the ability to alter consciousness at the quantum level were ever developed, it might not be something openly discussed. Governments could see it as a strategic advantage. Corporations might see it as a way to influence behavior on a scale that makes today's targeted advertising seem quaint. Even well-meaning researchers might hesitate to share their findings if they feared misuse. The result could be a technology that exists in the shadows, shaping lives in ways no one can see or challenge. The ethical questions here are not abstract. They would demand clear boundaries, strict oversight, and perhaps even new kinds of rights. Rights that protect not only our physical bodies and personal data, but the integrity of our conscious experience. Just as we have laws to protect the privacy of our conversations, we might one day need laws to protect the privacy of our awareness itself. But there is a deeper reason to tread carefully. Consciousness is not just a system to be optimized. It is the place where we live. Every memory, every dream, every sense of self takes shape there. To treat it as something to be engineered without limits is to risk losing sight of what makes it valuable in the first place. If awareness becomes just another resource to be tuned for efficiency or profit, we may end up with minds that function more smoothly, but feel less like their own. And yet, it is impossible to deny the pull of possibility. If we could truly understand the quantum roots of awareness, we might be able to help those whose minds have been fractured by illness or injury. We could restore lost capacities, ease suffering, and perhaps even expand the range of what it feels like to be human. The danger is not in the dream, but in forgetting that every dream has a cost if pursued without care. In the end, the risks and the promises of quantum consciousness research are reflections of the same truth. To touch the foundations of awareness is to touch something both powerful and fragile. It is a place where physics meets personhood, and where the smallest changes can ripple outward into the shape of a life. That is why, before we can decide what to do with this knowledge, we must first decide who we want to be when we hold it, and that decision will require wisdom as much as science. Because in the quiet spaces between measurement and meaning, between probability and choice, the question is not just what we can do, but why we would do it, and whether we can trust ourselves with the answer. From here, our journey turns toward its close. We have followed the theory from its origins to its challenges, from the evidence in nature to its possible applications and dangers. Now we will step back, slow down, and let the pieces settle into a softer picture, one that sees consciousness not as a puzzle to be solved, but as part of a larger tapestry that includes the universe itself. For most of this journey, we have moved inward, down through neurons into microtubules and finally into the fleeting quantum events that might flicker at the heart of consciousness. But now it is time to look outward again, to let the focus widen until it holds not just the mind, but the whole sweep of the cosmos. Because if the theory we have explored is true, then consciousness is not just something that happens in the universe. It is something the universe does through us. Imagine for a moment that every time you open your eyes in the morning, you're not simply returning to awareness. You're letting the universe see itself again, from a new angle. The colours in your room, the sound of a bird outside, the memory of a dream fading at the edges, these are not private little signals sealed inside your skull. They are the world shaping itself into a form that can be felt. In this view, your mind is less like a spectator and more like a window, or perhaps a mirror, through which reality catches a glimpse of its own reflection. Physics tells us that the matter in your body was forged in ancient stars. The iron in your blood once sat at the core of a sun. The calcium in your bones was born in the fiery death of a supernova. Now those same atoms have arranged themselves into a structure that can think, remember, imagine, and wonder. And if the quantum events in your brain are part of this process, then they are not separate from the rest of the universe's laws. They are those laws, folding in on themselves to produce awareness. This changes the way one might think about meaning. In a purely mechanical view, life is a small, fragile accident against a backdrop of vast indifference. But if awareness is a natural expression of the universe's own structure, then meaning is not something imposed from the outside. It is something that arises naturally wherever conscious life appears. Every thought, every decision is part of the cosmos exploring its own possibilities. There is no need for this idea to become grand or mystical. It does not require believing that the universe has intentions or plans. It is enough to notice that there is a thread of continuity between the birth of a star and the spark of a thought. One is written in the language of gravity and fusion, the other in the language of neural signals and quantum probabilities. But both are pages in the same book, turning one after another without any clear dividing line. This is why the study of consciousness can feel so strangely personal. We are not simply investigating an object from the outside. We are looking at the very lens through which we see everything else. The more we learn, the more it becomes clear that to understand consciousness is, in some small way, to understand ourselves not just as people, but as parts of a much larger pattern, a pattern in which matter learns to feel, and the laws of physics learn to whisper in the first person. The universe has no shortage of ways to arrange itself. It can form galaxies, carve canyons, and grow forests. But the fact that it can also arrange itself into beings who look up at the night sky and feel wonder is perhaps its quietest and most improbable trick. When you tilt your head back to watch the stars, you're not just looking at them. They are, in a very real sense, looking back through you. And so, as we approach the end of this exploration, we are left not with a final answer, but with a feeling. The feeling that whatever consciousness is, whether it is truly rooted in quantum physics or not, it is something that binds us to the rest of reality in a way that is more intimate than we usually imagine. Your mind is not a separate bubble adrift in space. It is a place where the universe comes together for a moment to notice itself. This is not a truth you need to hold on to tightly. It is more like a quiet understanding you can let rest in the background, as steady and unobtrusive as the hum of the world at night. Tomorrow will bring new questions, new doubts, and new discoveries. But for now, it is enough to simply know that you are part of something vast, and that something vast is part of you. From here, there is only one step left. To close our eyes, let the question settle, and drift into the kind of rest that gives the mind space to do its quiet work. That step will be our final one, an invitation not just to sleep, but to trust that the same mysterious processes we have been talking about will keep flowing, gently, in the dark. There is a certain stillness that only comes at the very end of the day. The questions that pressed so urgently a few hours ago seem to have lost their sharp edges. The light is dim, the air is quiet, and the mind, though still turning, moves more slowly now, less like a river rushing toward its banks and more like the tide easing itself back from the shore. This is the moment when we can let go of the need to solve and simply allow ourselves to be carried. If consciousness truly rests on quantum events, on fleeting patterns that appear and vanish in the smallest spaces of the brain, then even now, in this calm, they are still at work. Every flicker of awareness, every faint impression drifting through your thoughts, begins as one of these microscopic moments. They do not stop when you close your eyes. They simply shift into another rhythm, one tuned not for outward attention, but for the quiet maintenance of the self. Sleep itself is a kind of voyage inward. The outer senses dim, and the mind begins to weave patterns that do not depend on the light of the outside world. Some of those patterns are dreams, brief stories the brain tells itself, drawn from fragments of memory and imagination. Others are far quieter, the subtle rebalancing of emotions, the slow reinforcement of learning, the almost invisible repair of the body's systems. If Orch-OR is right, then the quantum flickers inside your neurons may be part of this work, shaping the flow of thought and memory even as the rest of you rests. It is a comforting thought, that while you lie still, your mind is tending to itself, like a garden working quietly through the night. The roots continue to drink in what they need. The leaves adjust themselves toward an invisible light, and by morning something subtle has changed. You wake not only refreshed but slightly rearranged in ways you cannot fully name. There is a kind of trust required for sleep. You are letting go of control, surrendering hours of your life to a state where you cannot defend, direct, or decide. And yet, for most of us, the trust is not even conscious. It is simply something we do, because sleep comes whether or not we invite it. Perhaps this trust is easier when you remember that the processes that carry you through the night are the same ones that have been at work since the beginning of life. The same physical laws that guide the stars and the tides are guiding you too in your smallest moments. If consciousness is a way the universe experiences itself, then dreams might be a way it imagines. The images and scenes that float up in sleep do not need to make sense to be meaningful. They are like sparks from a fire, brief, glowing arcs that rise into the dark, fade, and vanish. But each one is part of the whole, part of the ongoing conversation between mind and matter, between the possible and the real. As you drift now toward your own rest, you might picture the activity inside your brain as a kind of night sky. Each quantum event is a tiny star, flickering for a moment before disappearing into the background. Some form constellations, patterns that carry memories, ideas, and emotions. Others appear and vanish without ever joining into something larger. Together they form the quiet landscape over which your awareness will travel until morning. You do not need to watch this happen. You do not need to guide it. The mind, like the body, knows the way. And in this there is a deep reassurance. You can let go without fear, because you are not falling into emptiness, but into a process as old as the universe itself. The same delicate physics that may have sparked your first thought will carry you into your next dream, and into the first thought of tomorrow. So tonight, let the questions rest. Let the debates fade. Whether consciousness is born from quantum collapses or from something else entirely, it is here now, holding you as you breathe in and breathe out. It will keep working in the dark, shaping the currents of your mind until the light returns, and when morning comes and you open your eyes, the universe will see itself again through you.